I'm Tressa Pankovitz. I co-direct the Reinventing America Schools project with my colleague, Curtis Valentine. We are housed at the Progressive Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., and that's where we research, write, advocate, and amplify what we call 21st century school systems. These schools have increased autonomy from school district structures. They offer enhanced choices for parents, and in exchange for all that, they are subject to increased accountability for student outcomes. We believe that these schools are a vehicle for offering increased educational equity to families and parents, especially those who don't have the resources on their own to afford an alternative option like a private school, perhaps. Today's webinar is the final installment, we believe, in our Politics of Education series, which we are presenting in partnership with the 74 Million. The 74 Million is one of the nation's best news sources for all things public education. I am very excited to present the panel that I've selected to be here for you today. I chose each and every one of these people for their diverse expertise on education and politics and for their compassion and care for the subject. I am going to let them introduce themselves to you, and then we will dive right into today's discussion. And we will start with ladies first. So Anya, you can go ahead.
Hi, I'm a journalist and author. I've written 5 books about various aspects of education, parenting, technology. I was at NPR as an education correspondent for 8 years. I'm currently advising the Aspen Institute on the Planet Ed initiative, which is about mobilizing children-focused institutions toward climate action. And I'm particularly overseeing a climate media initiative, trying to get more climate narratives into kids' media to end intergenerational climate silence.
Thanks, Anya. And I'm thrilled to have a fellow, as a former journalist, a fellow journalist with me here today. And I would be remiss if I did not show you her book that we will be talking about today. It's called The Stolen Year. I highly recommend it. It's very wonderful, wonderful piece of work. Now I'm going to go in alphabetical order. So that means, Andy, you are next.
We usually don't do alphabetical by first name. You caught me off guard. Andy Rotherham. I'm a co-founder and partner at Bellwether. We're a national education nonprofit consulting firm. There's about 90 full-time professionals at Bellwether working around the country with school districts, charter schools, states, foundations, various education intermediaries. I'm also on the board, the Virginia Board of Education. I was previously on that board appointed by Mark Warner. I'm back on the board appointed by current Governor Glenn Youngkin. And I guess for the purpose of this call, I should mention I'm a senior fellow at PPI, and I also am on the board of directors of the 74.
I'm sorry you have such a short resume. George Parker, you're up.
Hi, my name is George Parker. I taught mathematics in DC public schools for 30 years. Middle school. So if any of you out there taught middle school, you have my prayers. I also was president of the DC Teachers Union for 6 years, during probably one of its most reform-oriented periods when Michelle Rhee was there. And I now work as a senior advisor for the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. With all transparency, I have to say and tell you that I was not always supporters of charter schools. I initially, when I started out as union president, carried the regular union line that was anti-charter. I had growth in that now I'm a very strong supporter of charter schools because I believe parents deserve choice.
Thank you so much, George. Kevin, tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Thanks very much to you, Tressa, and to PPI. My name is Kevin Menken, and I am a senior writer for the 74million.org, which is a nonprofit education news site. I regret that I'm the only one on here who didn't have a cool first career. I learned math, George, for what felt like 30 years in K-12, but was only like 11 and a half, actually. I've spent the rest of my life atoning by covering education and educators. This is my 6th year at the 74. And I love telling the stories that go down in K-12 schools every day.
Well, I think you have a cool current career, so that's plenty enough. Yeah. Michael Hartney, all the way from California.
Yes. Hi, it's great to be with everyone today. I am typically not in California. I'm typically on faculty as a professor of political science at Boston College, but I'm spending some time out at the Hoover Institution as a Hoover Fellow, where I'm working on a book exploring the politics surrounding school closures during the pandemic. And just prior to that, I released a book earlier or later this summer, rather, on teachers' unions in American politics. And, thinking about George's comments of 30 years and Kevin's of 11 years, the book took almost that long. I started it back when I was a graduate student at Notre Dame in the late 2000s. So taking me full circle from the days of Scott Walker, all the days up through the pandemic. And my prior career was actually more on the policy side in education. I worked for a few years before graduate school at the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices.
And I have to show you Michael's book as well. It is very dense. There are a lot of numbers in here, but it is meticulously researched and it is absolutely fascinating. So I highly, highly recommend it. So strongly do I recommend it that if you don't have a way to get your own copy, I'm happy to loan it, but you have to give it back. So there you go. So this series has examined political influence in public education. And I have to admit that my colleague Curtis Fallon did most of the heavy lifting on this. They've done episodes on school boards and parents, all kinds of stakeholders. Today, we are going to talk, you might have guessed, about the single most powerful actor in public education, and those are the teachers' unions. Because most education policy is created at the state and local level, and we just had midterms, lots of politics, we're mostly going to focus on the outcomes of the midterms at the state and local level, because that's where the bulk of the action is when it comes to public education and teacher union activity. So, George, since we are talking about union influence, and you are my only panelist with lived experience as being a union leader, I think it makes sense to start with you. And I'm hoping you can give us a bit of a view from the inside. What are teachers' union when it comes to elections? What's it like leading a union during an election year? And how have things changed, maybe on the national scale, or evolved since the time that you were leading the union in Washington, D.C.?
Wow, that's a good question. Election time is a very important time for unions. It's a very busy time. When I was union president, election time, whether it was for school board members or state leaders or national, it was a very important time. Unions understand the power of the vote, and unions are very effective in terms of getting and turning out their troops on the ground. Unions have troops on the ground who can go and knock on doors, can impact elections, and unions have no shame in collecting payment for all of the officials that they help to get elected. I think the unions understand policy is made and people owing you favors in terms of helping to get them elected is a great source of power for unions. So that you made a statement earlier that unions were probably the most impactful source in terms of educational policy. I think that is true, though I think unions have stronger impact on Democratic leaders than on Republican leaders. And I think that divide has made it a little easier right now in terms of having a Democratic administration for unions to really shine a little more. In terms of the other question, in terms of what has changed significantly, I think the red-blue divide has changed things to the extent that we sometimes appear to make decisions based on emotions rather than logically what's best for kids. So I think the polarization that has occurred recently has just added to the rift between unions and school districts and et cetera, because people have a tendency sometimes now to make decisions based on whether you're red or blue, Republican, Democrat, as opposed to what's in the best interest of children. I think that educational policy should be like military when it comes to it. It should be bipartisan. Educating our children should be bipartisan. I think unions right now are feeling stronger in terms of impacting educational policy. But I also feel that unions have a challenge, and that is, how do you go against what parents want? Research shows that parents want choice, and charter schools overall are outperforming traditional public schools. So I think the union challenge is, how do you keep parents, especially parents who Black and brown children who in urban districts, the schools are failing tremendously. How do unions keep parents on their side when at the same time they are saying, we want to deny you choice? So I think those are the challenges that unions are going to face in terms of continuing to promote the same type of programs and policies that unions have promoted.
So, we have a very pro-union governor in Illinois, J.B. Pritzker, and we have a Democratic governor in New York State. Kathy Hochul said she would consider lifting caps. Now, that doesn't mean she's going to get that through Albany, but she made a concession to the charter school cap that's been in New York City for so long. J.B. Pritzker, at the end of the education, came out in favor of education savings account, which doesn't really help the charter school sector, but it does show a loosening up on choice. Do you think that we might see more Democrats that are going to have to, if not embrace charter schools, at least soften their stance because of parents?
I think so. And more than that, I think that Democrats are going to have to embrace it because it's right. To have traditional public schools as the only option, especially for poor families, I think that can't exist forever. And I think that unions and I think that Democrats are going to have to come around to understand that though you may owe unions for helping to get you elected, we don't owe them our children. And so I think that they're going to have to come around to accepting the fact that traditional public schools are failing in many places. And some of that fault lies within unions. When I was a union leader, I also supported certain policies that prevented the kind of reforms that were needed in order to help children. So I think unions are going to have to begin to accept charter schools because choice, I think, is very difficult to deny parents choice. We got choice in tennis shoes we want to buy. We got choice in cars. Yet one of the most important things that can determine a child's life, education, we're saying to parents, you only have one choice. And right now that choice for many urban school districts are failing schools. The parents aren't going to buy it forever.
Thanks so much, George. That's some very powerful words. And I have to admit, I hope you're right. Michael, you would probably say that George is overly optimistic. I want to say up front, you took great pains in the preface of your book to make it clear that you're not making value judgments with the book. You're just a social scientist reporting on policy choices and the outcomes of those choices. But I'd love to hear you put forth your hypothesis of why the 3 M's, money, members, and maintenance, mean that the unions are never going to give an inch.
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the pandemic was a wake-up call for parents who probably didn't pay a lot of attention to the weeds of education politics before what Rick Hess sort of has referred to during the pandemic as the custodial role of schools, that people see their kids get picked up, they're making friends, they're going to school. And then all of that changed overnight. And a lot of parents discovered for the very first time that there was an interest group in their district that had, and if not a veto power, certainly a unique seat at the table in discussions over reopenings and getting an MOU and how many hours of instruction their kids would get. And these were just things that parents wouldn't have thought about before the pandemic. And I argue in my book that this all traces back to the beginning of teacher unionization, which was with exclusive representation and collective bargaining, where teachers' unions, compared to all other stakeholders, got this automatic seat at the table in states that had these laws. And the members' money and maintenance, what that refers to is the fact that any interest group that wants to be effective in the political arena has to have at least some of these things. They have to have money for political advocacy. They have to have members, as George said, troops that they can turn out in elections, and they have to be able to maintain that year over year. And I won't get into the sort of nitty gritty on the academic side, but in the book, I show how labor law provided those advantages to teachers' unions so that year in and year out, they were able to maintain their members, maintain money in political advocacy in ways that parents aren't. And so in an example that's very sort of not academic and scientific, I would sort of refer folks to the lesson that came out of a movie with Maggie Gyllenhaal a few years ago that was about parent trigger laws. And there's this scene that's actually pretty accurate, I think, in the film that shows the struggle that she encountered when it came time to try and convert her child's failing school into a charter school. She didn't have a directory of parents in the district. She didn't know where they lived. She had to take days off from work to try to contact people. And in contrast, after collective bargaining came into place, these are things that teachers' unions did have. They were all in the building. They had access to the mailbox. In many districts, the union president's time off was subsidized, right? So collective bargaining gives teachers' unions this sort of built-in advantage. And I would add to that it's a very powerful advantage to deploy it in state and local politics. And I don't know how much we'll talk about local politics today, but in local school board elections where turnout is typically very low, those advantages go a long ways towards being successful.
That's right. And they're still continuing to pass collective bargaining laws. There are some states that have passed laws very recently intended to blunt the impact on the unions of a recent Supreme Court. I think it was about 5 years ago, that's commonly called Janus, that where the court ruled that unions could no longer collect agency fees from non-members. States are passing laws designed to make it more difficult for non-members to opt out of paying dues. So again, there's a lot that happens in the state legislatures that trickles right down into the classroom. But you started by talking about parents, and that means I'm going to go to Anya next, because you spent well over a year following for your book a handful of parents, and it was amazing how economically, racially, geographically, rural, urban, you really found a wide variety of families to follow. There was a family with a special needs child, family with gifted children. What are some common themes that you found as it relates to their experience in the pandemic and all the politics around the schools the last couple of years?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that, Tressa. But I first want to state on the record that I'm not on board with this union bashing. I'm a supporter of unions. I think that I'm a member of a union. And I think it's not data driven. I mean, charter schools don't do better by kids than public schools by and large. 25 of our states are right to work states, and they don't do better than our teacher unionized states. So the only reason to target and bash unions is because you have an ideological commitment to a libertarian philosophy that doesn't support worker power. And I'm not on board with that. I'm a socialist, okay? Democratic socialist. So I want to state that. Not interested in engaging on it, but that's how I feel. When it comes to the families in my book, I followed 5 families from around the country. 2 of them actually were teachers as well as parents. They were one in Oklahoma, not a union member, one in DC public schools. And they all shared a feeling of intense betrayal. That was what really stood out. The fact that the institutions that serve families in this country are so weak, so limited. And when push came to shove, these families are basically left on their own. And public schools are really the only institution in our society that serves children in any kind of coordinated way. And we don't have a childcare system. We don't have healthcare for kids. We don't have a public housing system that works. We don't have income support for families. We don't have paid family leave. All we have is public schools. And that is what our kids rely on if they are in the foster care system, if they have homelessness, housing issues, if they need healthcare, mental health care, or meals. And so when schools shut down, all of those things were taken away. You know, I definitely point the finger at progressives. Progressives abandoned kids. They didn't stand up for kids when they needed it. And similarly, in Republican states where they didn't really provide for families in the same way, there were, you know, federal programs that came in, but child hunger was widespread, especially in the first months of the pandemic. And the feeling of betrayal is something that really lasts because families felt so isolated, and, you know, the lack of social supports, even grandparent support, neighbor support, the types of things that families rely on. That was a common thread across class and across race and across geographies.
Can you elaborate on what you said about the progressives?
Yeah, blue states didn't stand up for opening public schools. There was a lack of leadership in many states. There are some exceptions, such as in Rhode Island and Connecticut, where progressive leaders, and I would also actually put Bill de Blasio on that list. Controversially enough, he really stood up among the top 10 largest public school districts in the country, the ones in blue states. He was the one who spoke most loudly in favor of opening schools, reopening schools. He wasn't able to fully, succeed in that. But I think it's also really important to note that progressive constituencies, particularly Black, Hispanic, and Asian American families, were worried about going back to school. And there are many places where charter schools weren't able to open either because those families that they served didn't want to go back to school. And so, you know, the politics of it were very, very complicated.
Yeah, they certainly are. And, you know, I have to say that Lori Lightfoot in Chicago went absolutely toe to toe with the union there over their demands to keep schools closed in the early winter of 2021. I think that was,
Yep.
Right. Yeah. And they were still
Absolutely.
And I know the UTLA in Los Angeles was making a lot of really ridiculous requests that had nothing to do with educating children as a precondition for coming back to the classroom. But I just want to clarify one thing. This is not about union bashing. This is about looking at the influence and power of unions in school districts, which is undeniable. And also from a personal standpoint, I am not anti-union. I actually, as a television reporter, tried to organize a union. I was at a non-unionized TV station, and that effort failed by one vote and really kind of put my career off trajectory for quite some time. I've obviously recovered, but I think unions in the private sector are fabulous. The role of the corporate is, the bottom line is money. I think the role of public services, whether it's police, fire, teacher, is quite different, the goals and the mission. We don't need to engage on that, but I just wanted to clarify that I am not in any way like wholeheartedly anti-union. But with that said, I'm going to go to Andy Rotherham a little bit out of my original order here and ask him to address the tension between the historic tension between the charter unions and the charter union schools and teachers union.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. I find just to add a little bit of just context, I find the entire conversation about if someone's anti-union or pro-union, it's a ridiculous conversation. And I mean, I certainly respect Anya's commitments and so forth, but you know, what are we even talking about? I mean, just historically, there's an enormous distance between, you know, minors fighting for safety in their lives in places like Colorado and West Virginia, and teachers unions during the pandemic saying we're not going to go back to school and educate kids until you put in place a charter school cap or address some sort of longstanding funding issue. I mean, I just don't even know how you have those things in the same conversation. And it's more heat than light. And I think the real conversation that's happening and goes to your question is this question of how do you, in the public sector, and this is, you know, go back to Roosevelt, there's been concerns about this. How do you balance power in the public sector and deliver public services effectively? Reasonable people can disagree, but that's where the conversation is, and sort of how does power play out, and who who has it and so forth. And that's the sort of union, whether you're sort of for unions or you're anti-union, it kind of gets tossed around like an epithet in this debate, but it doesn't, I don't know exactly what it illuminates. So on the charter school question, it's actually really interesting. There was, everyone wants to have a charter school narrative, right? And all of them are sort of incomplete. The teachers unions, their narrative is that charters were this great way to deliver, autonomous schools in a union context. And then they almost tell it like biblical terms. Then there was this fall and charters were, these other people came and like, we need to get them back to their original like Eden-like state. The libertarians tell a story of how this was like the first sort of foray into public education and sort of starting to do choice on the way to vouchers. The alternative school people tell their own story about how it created space to deliver alternative schools. And in truth, it was in different ways, it was all of these things. Teacher union leaders, Al Shanker, they were involved at the beginning. They had a vision for how this could be a kind of autonomous schooling that comported with union values. Libertarians were there. People from the alternative school movement who were just looking for space to create and open the kinds of schools they wanted to open were there. And it's always been this sort of awkward marriage that gets complicated when other options are on the table. So whether that's ESAs on the education savings accounts or school vouchers, that suddenly complicates the politics because you have folks in the charter community who are like, yeah, I'm good with those things too. And you have other folks who are like, oh no, that's not what I signed up for. And so you've always had all these tensions. Now, in terms of the unions, specifically in the politics, what's become a couple of things have become apparent. One, the real issue, nothing is magic about a charter. Speaking of like another debate that's more heat than light. Nothing's more, nothing magic about a charter. What it does give you is some autonomy at the school site level around things like hiring, firing, how you organize and deploy resources, how you use time. Very valuable and important things in school that these sort of very constrictive union contracts, when you talked about sort of Chicago, and when you get into these debates and you see what like the minutes we're arguing over for how long the school day is going to be, and everybody knows it's like an insufficient amount, but we're arguing over it's going to be a little less insufficient or a little more insufficient. That's all incompatible with delivering high quality schools at any scale. And that's all that the best charters show, is when you have that kind of autonomy, you can be intentional about things and you can deliver a higher aggregate quality of services. Is that sort of inherently incompatible with unionization? I don't think so. I think you can marry those two things. It's quite incompatible though with how we do unionization today in the education sector. And that's really where the friction is. I think most people are sort of exhausted by the sort of broader politics. They just want schools to have leverage over really key things like who's in front of kids, and what they are, and who, if they're not performing well in front of kids, what's the process for getting somebody else there? How is time and resources deployed? These are pretty elementary things, and that's where the debate is playing out more. And that's the threat for the teachers union. The market share threat is real as these schools grow, and they're obviously fighting that. But also the threat is it just speaks to there are different ways to deliver education. There are ways the parents prefer. I mean, we talked about the threat of the pandemic and declining enrollment, which you've seen is rising enrollment in other sectors, including charter schools. And so we should talk about how parents are voting with their feet. And that's sort of, those are the friction points. And that's where the unions are gonna have to figure out how they navigate through that. And do they sort of want to constantly be fighting this rearguard action and losing members and so forth? Or do they want to help reimagine what's a different vision for public education, delivering high quality public services that includes more empowerment and agency for parents and for kids? And how they decide to approach that conversation will matter a lot to the politics of charter schools. I think it'll matter a lot just the politics of public education more generally.
You raised a very interesting question about voting with their feet. And we have seen a lot of enrollment changes. And I'm going to switch gears a little bit and go to Kevin. And, you covered this election from coast to coast. And you've also covered the pandemic and the disenrollment and the missing kids and all of that. What do you take away? How did parents vote when they voted with their ballot this year?
That's a pretty good way to frame it. As you mentioned, the school enrollment trends indicate basically that a profound dissatisfaction with the public education status quo during the pandemic led a lot of families to leave their incumbent schools. This is a phenomena that Anya covered beautifully in her book. And there were political ripples to these phenomena as well. You, on the one hand, have seen at the local level a willingness to really stir the pot on the part of local activists and activist groups who have been launching themselves into school board candidacies and state superintendent races during this cycle that have historically been enormously sleepy. I mean, catatonic would probably be the better adjective to describe local races about education governance. These things just do not move the needle in terms of local or statewide politics. This year, that has been different. And you've seen spending by typically right of center groups, conservative groups, but also they've been matched by some left of center groups in these races that really popped for me as a guy who reports on education politics. In terms of the statewide races, I don't think that this election cycle was a great advertisement for a mass movement that has had it. They're sick to death with the education status quo, and they're throwing off the fetters of the education establishment. We just didn't see that hypothesis prove out. And I would direct, for what could be a variety of reasons, but I would direct people's attention probably to the governor's races. Democrats had what you'd have to call a really terrific night. They picked up, I want to say, 3 state houses, 3 governor's mansions, I guess you'd say, and they lost only 1 in this election cycle. That's reasonably uncommon for a midterm election, which your party holds power. And I'd probably look to say one example. And that's the best example in the country of the kind of blue ripples that countered the red wave. Take a look at the state of Michigan. State of Michigan is essentially the inverse this election of the state of Florida. Republicans didn't do better anywhere, I would submit to you, than they did in the state of Florida, and Democrats didn't do better anywhere than they did in the state of Michigan. You had an incumbent Democratic governor win re-election enormously convincingly in terms of the margin. And she brought along control over her state legislature, which we're seeing for the first time in 40 years. So if parents were outraged in Michigan over critical race theory or trans participation in girls' sports or COVID lockdown measures dating back 2 years, you just didn't see it in this cycle. As a matter of fact, she really was kind of the opposite of Ron DeSantis. And I would assert that the reasons for her overperformance and for the overperformance of a lot of Democratic governors is that it can be attributed to a couple of factors. One, and this is pretty clear in Michigan, you've got candidate quality. Gretchen Whitmer is clearly ready for prime time. She's somebody that was considered as a vice presidential prospect in 2020. And she performed very well in all sectors of political mobilization in this race. Her opponent was Republican first-time candidate Tudor Dixon, didn't really bring a lot in the way of experience, fundraising, coalition building in this cycle. You saw that across the country. So whatever dissatisfaction we saw in terms of K-12 education, it wasn't enough in Michigan and in other states to overcome the structural burdens the Republicans were facing. They couldn't just leverage disappointment with educational conditions this time.
Yeah, that's right. And Michigan is one of 4 new trifectas with the House, the Senate, and the governor all going to Democrats. That was picked up this year. I think it was Massachusetts, Maine, and Minnesota, along with Michigan. And so I'm going to come back to you, George, with Michigan. The NEA was claiming victory. Your organization was also feeling pretty good about things were being much better than they were after the 2018 midterms, but the National Alliance said their biggest concern is Michigan. In your first round of sharing with us, you mentioned that the unions have no shame in asking for payment for political support. So what are you concerned might happen in Michigan, and what are some strategies maybe to protect parents who really highly value choice and are used to having a lot of it in that state?
Wow, that's a good question. First of all, let me just make sure that I make it clear to everyone, I'm still a union supporter, a teachers union supporter. And I don't consider bashing unions as a solution. I do believe, though, and I have to take accountability for my own leadership as a union president, that union contracts also help to set educational policy for school districts. And I think that to the extent that those contracts negatively impact the school district's ability to move forward in the way that it can really educate kids, we as unions have to take some accountability as well. In terms of the Michigan piece, I guess my first question would be, was education the first thing on the voters' minds? I don't know how to interpret the fact that you have a trifecta in Michigan and how to relate that to education. I'm not sure that every voter who went in and voted Democratic had education the first thing on their mind. So I think that it's important that Democrats or Republicans or whoever don't read too much into the fact that there are three Democrats. Education may not have been 1, 2, or 3 on the choices, but I do feel that unions would feel, and I think they have a right to feel that, look, we have a we have a trifecta. So what our policy should be received warmly by that doesn't necessarily hold true. I think Andy was right when he said Gretchen is a very good leader. I think that she can also see that there is a need for charters. Now, so I don't think that they're going to overly read too much into the election in terms of this was a vote on education as much as a vote about a lot of the issues. But from a union perspective, you have to feel good when you have a trifecta that there is a lot more receptive to union policies. And some union policies are good. I'm not sure that I blame unions for traditional public school teachers not going back as quickly as parents would have liked. I think that unions to some degree had the interest of teachers' health at heart. I think that some of the school districts were a little slow in terms of putting safeguards in place to ensure teachers were going to be safe and that students were going to be
safe. And that is an excellent point, and one that Anya made in her book. Anya, tell us what you heard from the folks who had that exact fear.
The fear of coming back to school?
Fear that the districts themselves weren't doing enough to protect teachers from getting
students
and students.
And what you saw that some teachers and what some parents were doing as an alternative.
Well, I mean, so this fear took different forms in different communities. I mean, we have, gross inequity in our schools, and that extends to our school building infrastructure. So memorably, Patricia, who was a special education aide in DC, she told me about when she taught being in a pre-K classroom, seeing rats running over the children while they were napping. So how are you going to tell me then that this school is clean and safe and ready in the middle of a pandemic? And then
didn't in one instance they actually take a pencil and scribble on the desk?
That was Annie in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. She was and she became a very, very vocal opponent of returning to school. But she said, they said they were going to implement enhanced cleaning procedures. Well, I drew on the desk and they didn't even wipe it off the next day. So what are you telling me about it? I don't even have soap in the bathrooms. There's not even time in the day to watch for the kids to wash their hands at good intervals. I mean, tell me about ventilation. My windows don't open. When they do open, there's a construction site outside. There's dust blowing on the children. I mean, these are very real things that we didn't invest in as a nation. To, you know, there are places, private schools that opened outdoor campuses that did what was needed. Right? Why didn't we take over empty office buildings and put kids in there? The YMCA's opened up their buildings for emergency childcare, putting children in boardrooms so that there would be distancing and creating the system for essential workers that needed it. As a nonprofit, they lost millions of dollars stepping in. Why didn't we foster and why didn't we summon that kind of energy as a public school system? I think it's something we have to take a really hard look at.
Yeah, I really agree with that. My idea was, we've got all these empty theaters all over the place, movie theaters, Broadway theaters, all kinds of theaters. Why don't we use some of these big cavernous spaces, gyms, and just put everybody really far apart, especially once we started recognizing that it was an airborne disease. But, I'm just going to throw this out there. Actually, I'm going to go to Michael. Michael, you've been sitting quietly for a minute. Where do parents and teachers who have this outrage at the way the system is so straitjacketed, where do they go? What do they do? You talk about in your book, going back to the 1970s or 80s, that there's a graveyard, you call them, of parent union type organizations that can never kind of quite get going. And some of the people I met through Anya's book sounded like, except they were mostly women who were so exhausted with childcare, but otherwise would have been the type to maybe be prompted by an event like the pandemic to become an activist. How is there any hope for parents to actually affect change with the system the way we see it in here?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big things is that procedurally, it's an uphill climb to try and change who holds power in education policy at the local level. For one thing, a lot of these elections for school board are held at odd times of the year. That leads, parents make up a huge minority of the voters in these elections. It's largely adult interests that are being fought over. And I don't just mean teachers and employees there. I also mean, people who have a stake in what the school district buys.
Anybody who sat in a school board meeting even once absolutely knows that this is true.
And then you add to it issues like the fact that, we stagger these elections. So it's not like an analog like you have with Congress, where if you're really angry one year, you can, quote, throw the bums out and start over in a single year. And so that's important because it means that if you want a new parent advocacy group to actually get a foothold or get a real seat at the table, they've got to stick with it for more than one election. And I think that's where I get concerned. I don't want to be a total downer about it. But when you mentioned in my book, I went back and looked, and in the 1970s, when there were strikes or there were other events, I'm thinking about the Philadelphia Parents Union that came into place, or other instances of parents wanting to get involved because of some crisis, not like a COVID, but something else. There's a lot of interest right off the bat, but it tends to wane. Understandably, especially as the parents' kids go through school, they graduate and they move on. So I do wonder, there has been some research looking into how do charter schools in and of themselves shape parental activism in education, because you can argue that they give parents more skin in the game in the sense that they feel, okay, here's a school sector, and if the state legislature passes a law that curtails it or it doesn't get the funding it deserves, it's going to influence my kid's education. But, there were a lot of well-done papers on this probably about 10 years ago that showed that there's an opposite side to this too, which is it sort of puts a Band-Aid on the problem for those parents who are exercising the choice, which is good for them and their families, but they don't just instantly become educational activists because they suddenly have choice. So I don't necessarily expect, unlike what you saw in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, or unlike what George went through in DC, where you had a radical governance change where the superintendent, rather than sort of a parochial-minded elected school board, ran the show. You didn't get that with the pandemic. You had a crisis. You're seeing part of the result being disenrollment, a non-trivial share of parents, quote, voting with their feet. But up until recently, in states like California, for example, and understandably, by the way, in the first year, a lot of states were sort of doing a stopgag in terms of funding for schools that lost enrollment. And that was certainly needed in the beginning. But if over time, the reason that there's disenrollment or parents are feeling like the schools aren't serving them the way they want, you're going to run into this problem in a couple of years. A lot of people have talked about this, when a lot of the stimulus dollars or a lot of the ESSER funds are being spent on full-time positions, and then schools run out of money, and you've got the charter schools or these new schools having their hand out and wanting to continue to get funding. And then the traditional sector, if it's lost enrollment, also with its hand out saying we need to continue these positions. I think you're going to have some pretty big political battles in a couple of years over those funding issues.
I think what surprises me is that when you think about when George was in Washington, D.C. and Mayor Finnety, had this extraordinary control over the schools, and they were able to put in a bunch of reforms. Or you think about Hurricane Katrina, which, destroyed 100 of 110 school buildings or something like that in 2005 in New Orleans, and forced the evacuation of the whole city. I mean, those are big momentous events. But compared to every school in America closing the way it did, you call it a black swan event. This seems to me like it should have been a black swan event that would have maybe played out at the ballot box or in other ways, but you don't seem to think that.
Largely because it doesn't have the same institutional changing mechanism. So in New Orleans, the entire system reconstitutes as a choice-based system. That's like, in effect, a quasi-governance change. In DC, that was a governance change. You're not getting that here. So you're getting a lot of frustration, you're getting some disenrollment, but you're not really changing sort of the architecture of school governance in any way. In fact, if anything, you look at a place like Chicago, which was one of the places. And I do want to say a word about closures. Chicago, I just spoke with about a week ago. I had an interesting interview with the superintendent of the Archdiocese of the Catholic schools in Boston. In a lot of our big urban districts, you had Catholic schools that were not exactly, they weren't located in newly built, top of the line buildings. They were running on shoestring budgets, and they were they experienced huge enrollment booms by 21-22 because they reconstituted and got back to in-person learning more quickly. And I think that, so if you go to a place like Chicago, I think we're going in the wrong direction. The city is going to return to an elected school board when it's had a mayor-run system for a while. And I will say, though mayoral control, and I'd love to hear George's thoughts on this, but mayoral control oftentimes gets attacked for being non-small d democratic. But I think it's hard to argue that it's less democratic when you look at a place like DC, where a lot of voters in DC had turned on Michelle Rhee. And ultimately, it was very easy for the electorate to sort of have their say, because all they had to do was make that known in a single mayoral election when they voted Mayor Fenty out. I mean, I personally think it was a bad choice for education reform. I wanted to see her continue and see what she could do. But you can't say it wasn't democratic because the voters had their say. Whereas I think Chicago's going in the wrong direction here. And the parochial nature of school board governance is going to not be a good thing for Chicago moving forward.
I'd also like to hear George's takes. I feel like that election with Fenty has taken on this sort of monocausal thing that it was Michelle, whereas there was a lot going on in the city, and there was a lot of, Fenty's style was not a fit with all aspects of the city and so forth. And the voters have not in DC walked away from the education reforms that George and Michelle put in place. They changed governance, but there's actually a fair amount of continuity in a lot of those reforms, particularly things like the evaluation system. I feel like we often these sort of narratives get going in education, and you can criticize Michelle, but I'm not sure we want to draw the lesson that sort of voters turn on this stuff on a dime. I think it may be more the lesson Michael's talking about. It's harder to get voters more generally fired up around these issues. But once the momentum is there, there was a big narrative about Virginia and Youngkin. I mean, there was a ton of hand wringing at PPI when Youngkin
won a year after Biden beat Trump, and you're on the school board now there. So, I mean, I had intended to ask you, you know, kind of a check. How's that going? Are parents happy with what they got? Because it was really parents that drove that outcome.
Yeah, I mean, look, a couple of things. The Youngkin win, I think you have to look at it against the 2017 race with Ralph Northam more than the 2020 race with Biden. The Biden race was going to be a high watermark. Virginia, a lot of government employees here, a lot of military. So you had a lot of folks who were really frustrated and exasperated at the end of the rope with Donald Trump's style of governing. And so it was not surprising that you saw a really high turnout for Biden, you know, given his history in government and so forth in 2020. The Youngkin obviously performed much better in 2021. I don't want to take anything away from that than 2017, but I don't think the sort of Biden benchmark's the right one. He outperformed relative to what Republicans did in 2017, and that's noteworthy. And to your point, one of the reasons was clearly education. You saw, particularly in some of the counties in Northern Virginia, just huge vote shifts, Loudoun County, Fairfax County, where you'd had these issues. What was interesting is Youngkin's first executive order, it had a divisive concepts component to it, which got all the attention, but the majority of it was actually about school quality and accountability and so forth. That was like, if you just read it, which of course nobody does, but if you actually read it, that was the overwhelming majority of the text. And he said, I want to get a report on what's going on with school accountability. And a few months later, he got that report. And the report said, look, we haven't been leveling with the public about the school performance in terms of how we do accreditation and so forth, where our cut scores are on tests. And people were, you know, shocked and there was, you know, lots of political debate and so forth. But like behind the scenes, like a lot of Democrats, like this is a report we should have put out. And it is a report the Democrats should have put out because it called attention to the fact that our accountability and accreditation system makes, you know, tens of thousands of Black and Hispanic kids just invisible. They just don't count in our accountability system. That's an issue that Democrats should be championing, but it's languished. Also, obviously, there's a push for choice and parent empowerment, and parents want more choice. Why Democrats aren't leading on that issue too, sort of, you know, blows my mind. I guess I was absent the day at Democrat school where Democrats aren't supposed to be for empowering the poor. And so you look at these
that day too.
Youngkin's taken on, they're issues that like they've just been sort of left there. And it's inexplicable that they're not more competitive, that they're not more competitive issues. And I think that's sort of the takeaway. And you look, we talked earlier about Michigan, like Florida, I think is a state that sort of goes against a little bit the narrative that Kevin laid out. You know, DeSantis performed extremely well, and his school board candidates performed extremely well. Like something is going on down there that I think both parties should be paying attention to. Republicans are going to probably want to try to replicate it. Democrats ought to learn from it. And some of the things that he is doing and a lot of the things that Youngkin are doing are way more popular among voters than you're going to hear on, say, Twitter or MSNBC. And those are some questions Democrats need to ask themselves if they want to be competitive on this issue or they want to start to see this issue. Choice is a popular issue. Empowering parents is a popular issue. Having schools conceal things from parents and families, not a popular issue. Not being honest about school performance, not a popular issue. And so I think there's an opportunity. And going to Michigan, you don't have to do choice, you know, in Michigan, that's not super popular and the political alignment is what it is, but you can do lots of other stuff to give kids and families more agency, career technical education, different opportunities for kids as they transition from high school into post-secondary. There's lots of things that you can do to be competitive that aren't just choice. But what has been sort of amazing is you've got some good examples, Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, or Jared Polis out in Colorado. But how many Democrats have just sort of taken like an ostrich-like posture to this, Tressa, and just like pretending that this isn't happening? And so to some extent, some of the Republicans probably can't believe their good fortune.
The lack of Democratic leadership created a vacuum. And, you know, the Republicans aren't dumb. They stepped right into it. And, you know, so we had two people said they wanted to hear from George on this. George, you were, you know, a leader of a school in a school district in a very urban city with a lot of poverty, still have a lot of poverty there. why do you think Democrats have taken the ostrich approach? Like what Andy said?
I think one, let me go from my own experience. Choice is a catch-22 for unions, right? It's like, how do you support school choice? At the same time, you see school choice as a threat to your membership. For example, I remember as a part of the teachers union in DC, before I became president, I was still a very active union member. I can remember when we had 8,000 teachers paying dues to the union. When I left at the end of 2010, we were down to 5,000 teachers. From a union perspective, and I'm sure most other union leaders feel the same way I do, and I think it's a catch-22 that unions haven't figured out. Rightfully so, unions should be supportive of choice, right? That we are the choice people, right? But at the same time, choice for unions mean you're losing membership, because as students leave the traditional public schools to go to charter schools, your membership has a tendency to decrease. Charter schools are much more difficult to organize because a lot of charter schools are just singular charter schools. Charter schools may have 120 students. Charter schools may have 20 teachers. It's not financially sensible for unions to spend $200,000 to organize 20 teachers. It would take forever to break even. So the best approach for unions is, let's not have charters let's blunt the growth of charter schools, because in essence, unions are protecting their own bread and butter. And that is union dues, for example, when I had 8,000 teachers in DC versus union dues when you have 4,000 teachers, that significantly decreases your ability to impact policy when your budget is cut in half because your teachers are leaving, going to non-union charter schools. And then to organize those charter schools is a major cost. So the best place for unions, if you still want to maintain your monopoly, is to find a way not to support choice. But that's something unions are going to have to come to grips with, because they're on different pages than parents are. Parents want choice. But from a union standpoint, the union's very existence depends on teacher union dues. And when you're reducing the number of teachers in traditional public schools where unions have a strong hold, especially in major urban districts, when you're reducing the number of teachers, you're reducing the amount of power that unions have in terms of impacting policies and et cetera. So I think it's a catch-22 that unions haven't figured out yet. And when I was a union president fighting charters, that was the main reason, to be honest with you. It had very little to do with the quality of education. It had to do with the existence of the union and the amount of impact that unions can have on educational policy. And it's a very difficult situation to be on the opposite side of parents. But unions should be about choice. But how do you be about choice when that choice, especially the major choice is for charter schools, is going to take away your membership and eventually take away some of the power that you have to influence educational policy?
Well, there are some examples out there of what we call a third way. I visited some schools in Springfield, Massachusetts, just 2 weeks ago, where there were terribly, terribly failing schools. They were like in the 1% for the state. And they still are unionized, and they're completely independent of the district, and they're doing things a whole different way. And at one of the panels at lunchtime, the union president was on the panel. And so, Andy mentioned unions needing to evolve. I don't pretend to be at a pay grade to have, all the answers, but there are some schools that are semi-autonomous schools in Fort Worth, Texas. The teachers are still district employees, but they're governed in partnership with Texas Wesleyan University, and they're doing amazing things for very, very low income children who are just very marginalized in every way, and their families. And if you look at Indianapolis, a quarter of the Indianapolis schools now are in innovation schools, and they're working it out. And these schools are contract run. It's a contract with the district. And so the accountability is enhanced. And David Osborne and I wrote a report with some model legislation on this about a year or so ago. It's still on our website. And I really hope that anybody that feels frustrated by this problem might, think about taking a look at it or trying to get it into the hands of, policymakers who can actually maybe think about making it as a reality. And I want to apologize. We didn't divide up our time perfectly evenly. Not everybody got as much of a chance to talk as some others did. And that was just because I threw my script out. The conversation just went in completely different directions, but I feel like it was very constructive. I hope our audience got something valuable out of it and learned a few things. And I'm just going to throw it out there. Does anybody have anything to say before I sign us off?
I'd like to say this. I think one of the major problems with the charter movement and unions is fear. Unions fear charters because they see charters as a means of decreasing union membership, right? But charters also fear unions, because they feel unions will come in and then limit their ability and the autonomy that they have, et cetera. The big challenge is, how do charters and unions find that line of demarcation that's a win-win for both?
Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Any ideas, Andy, Kevin?
I've only got a political observation to share, which is briefly that we've spent the last half decade or so kind of wondering, I think those of us observing education, where the education policy debate was going to go with the crack up of the coalition behind school reform that was always bipartisan for many, many years. And the 2022 midterm elections have not given us a clear answer. It's a split verdict. For Democrats, the lesson of these elections has been stick to your guns, stick by your traditional allies. Teachers unions, among others, will stick by you and they will help you deliver votes. For Republicans, the answer is be more like Ron DeSantis. So I don't see any kind of synthesis or reconciliation coming down the pike. And I don't know. I'm a bit in confusion as to what the future holds myself.
I agree with that, Kevin. I haven't heard a single idea today that seems like it's going to actually help kids. I think the reformist agenda is exhausted. Choice hasn't all across the board improved things for kids. Public schools are not necessarily all across the board helping kids. We don't have one single model. We have to have some new thinking. I like that you're talking about new models, but I mean, we didn't talk about kids really today. And that's a loss, I think.
Michael, any last words?
Yeah, I would just sort of add to Kevin's point that sort of if Democrats' lesson is to stick to their guns, I think on the Republican side, just one data point that really stuck with me on the results of the election is that in Florida, where you had Governor DeSantis making all of those endorsements, and 25 out of his 30 school board candidates won, that was a real outlier. And I would predict that we'll see more Republican executives with big political aspirations trying to do that. It took the teacher union win rate from a historical threshold of 70% of the school board candidates they endorsed won below 50%. And again, I'm not saying whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying that's a pretty shocking thing politically. And in all the other states that I've looked at, in the Midwest in particular, where Republicans didn't get involved that way, the unions also had their historical win margin. So I think we will probably see more of that robust electioneering at the local level in other states going forward.
Well, to end on an optimistic note, then, Tressa, I tend to agree with Michael's take and also Kevin's. we've had the best education policy ideas and practices come out of when there's been like real political competition. So that's, you know, when President Bill Clinton or then Governor Bill Clinton and first President Bush, you know, went to Charlottesville and put in place standards which were focused on raising expectations for kids and better preparing kids for opportunities and choices. That's charter schools, when you had this competition between to have school choice or not, and you wound up with this sort of hybrid model that sort of, contrary to what Anya said, is spread pretty wildly. And if you had said 25 years ago, we're going to have a model that's going to produce the kind of results that urban charter schools are producing, people wouldn't have believed you. And those results are pretty amazing. I mean, we talk about, we don't have anything that works. Like, charter schools in Boston are like doubling the school year for kids each year in terms of the amount of learning. And you look at sort of the gains in places like New York, LA, I mean, those are pretty remarkable. And that came out of political competition. To some extent, some of Obama's ideas came out of a time of political competition as well. Obviously, No Child Left Behind, when Democrats and Republicans really were going toe to toe on education in 99 and 2000. And so I say that by way, as we don't end on a bad note. I actually think, like, to Michael's point, both parties are trying to see what works. Michigan shows candidate quality matters, and sort of a parents' rights agenda is not a just add water thing. You know, Tudor Dixon couldn't get over the finish line with that. We're going to see what works, but more competition will ultimately benefit kids. It'll mean better ideas. Political tension in our system is actually a healthy thing. Constructive political tension. And so we may be entering a time where we're going to have some of that and that's a good thing we should all be excited about.
That's right. And I don't want to end on anything but a positive note. And I just want to thank you all for coming. I'd like you again to consider going to our website and checking out that report that David and I wrote. It's the Innovation Schools Guide, it's called, and it is a different way that, maybe it's a starting point for some of this while we do have all this political tension and while parents are paying such close attention. The kids in Indianapolis are doing great. There's also a video. I went to Indianapolis and interviewed a bunch of the teachers about why they chose Innovation Schools. It's about 7 minutes long. That's on YouTube and our website as well. So you can check it out for yourself. And congratulations on your books. Anya, I hope you do get your book in front of some policymakers, because there's a lot of policies that you highlighted that really need to change. And Michael, thank you for your exhaustive research. You've really given us a resource. George, fabulous as always. Thanks, everybody. And bye, Kevin.
All right, bye, everybody.